Telecameras 3 and 4 working. Activate radio contact with the outside.
Love, wisdom, abundant life. Live a life filled with meaning, purpose, and a sense of accomplishment.
Can you hear me?
Welcome to the Teachings of Enoch. I'm your host, James Allen. Listen every week at this time on KKVV AM 1060 Las Vegas. You can listen online at kkvv.com, on your smartphone using the TuneIn radio app, or listen anytime at teachingsofenoch.com. You can contact me, 702-483-7769. That's 702-483-7769. Or online at teachingsofenoch.com. Let's get started with today's message. My guest is Shannon Polson. Shannon is the author of North of Hope, a memoir of a journey she made after her parents were killed by a grizzly bear in Alaska. Shannon, thank you for appearing on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Shannon, as you made this journey to Alaska to kind of retrace your parents' last days, what prompted you to make that journey?
Well, I think it was a sense of need to both visit the place where they had died and also to be able to have a chance to finish their trip. And both of those things were really requirements that sort of developed for me over the year after they died. And right around the time that I had a chance to sing with the Seattle Symphony, the Mozart's Requiem, I came back from that performance, which we did at Benaroya with Yitzhak Perlman, and was sitting in my apartment just listening to the Requiem, looking through this book, which is called Seasons of Life and Land, and is a beautiful photographic journey through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and looking down at pictures of the Hula Valley, and really, I realized that it was a place that I'd never had a chance to visit, and it was a place that meant a great deal to both my father and stepmother, and of course the place that they died. And so I knew that I needed to finish their trip, and I knew that I needed to see the place where they died.
And this was about a year after the funeral that you made this decision to go on the trip?
Probably, actually closer to about 6 months after to make the decision, and then the trip that I took that followed their trip along the Hula River, again in the Arctic, was almost exactly 1 year after their trip where they had been killed.
Now, from Anchorage, how far is it a journey from Anchorage up to where your trip took place?
It's a long way, and as you know, having lived in Alaska, we actually started out flying out of Fairbanks, which is a 4-hour drive in the summer north of Anchorage, and then flew up to Kaktovik, which is a tiny little village on a barrier island off the northeast coast of Alaska, very close to the coast of Canada. There's only 300 people that live there. It's primarily an Inupiat village, and I think it was about a 2-hour flight from Fairbanks to Kaktovik on a Beech 1900. And then from there we took a Cessna to Grasser's Airstrip, which is the farthest accessible drop-off point on the Hula River. And because the Hula, like all of the rivers in the Arctic, is coming out of the Romanzov Mountains, all of the rivers in the Arctic flow north because the Romanzov Mountains are the northernmost tip of the continental divide where it flips kind of to the west across Alaska. And so all of the Arctic rivers flow north. So we flew south to Grasser's Airstrip in a Cessna, and that was probably just about an hour flight, but obviously a lot slower flying than in a jet, and then dropped off at Grasser's there with all of our gear for the trip.
Now, you made this trip with your brother. What was their initial response to making this journey?
Yeah, it was actually an adopted brother and a colleague of his that he knew from work. That was a good friend of his. They were both boaters, and we were not close at all. The adopted brother and I, and the colleague, and he certainly knew each other well, but I'd never met her before. So I think we were a bit of a motley crew. We came to primarily because it's pretty tough to find folks that are willing to travel to a place as remote and potentially dangerous as the Arctic, especially under the auspices that we were traveling. Both of my companions were boaters, and I was not a boater. I had done some kayaking, but mostly had spent time backpacking and doing more foot-propelled wilderness adventures. So we certainly had the wilderness experience, but I needed to be with some folks that had the boat experience, and didn't quite want to go with a guided group just because of not only the expense, but also because there's a bigger group. Usually it's a little bit more commercial, and given the nature of our trip, wanted to be with a smaller crew. So I think they understood, certainly my adopted brother understood the reasons and the importance of the trip. The colleague was a willing companion, and I'm happy to have her because we needed to have at least 3 folks on the trip. So.
Now, a lot of preparation is needed to take place for a trip like this, of course. And as you were planning this trip out, not necessarily the trip itself, but as you were planning the trip, what are some of the things that you started discovering about yourself and also about your parents?
That's a great question. Yeah, North of Hope is, as you've brought up, it's an adventure story, but it's also an adventure story not only in the wilderness, but North of Hope also is really looking at that journey, that internal journey as well, that follows the death and works through the grief process. And it's, I think I started to understand, although it took me a while even past the trip to understand that that journey, that internal journey, is not one that really has an end. It's just one that continues to change form, and it continues to move forward with your life as your life moves forward. But it's not something that has an end. And I think at one point, as I was initially inspired to travel up to the Arctic, I had the idea that the Mozart Requiem was going to be this cathartic event, being able to sing in the Requiem to honor my father and stepmother, and to share this gift of music that I had shared with my father in particular, was going to be something that was almost cathartic and really healing. And I didn't find that it was. I think I found that it was important. It was incredibly powerful, but it was just part of that journey. And for a while, I think I thought that traveling to the Arctic and finishing their trip and having a chance to see the place that they had died all would be cathartic as well. And in some ways, people frequently ask, does this provide closure? And I think that I started to understand pretty early on, and have now come to a better understanding, and this is part of what you'll read about in North of Hope, is that closure is it's not something I necessarily believe in. I think it's just an ongoing journey, and that journey continues to change. But I did understand as we're preparing, and there's certainly a lot of logistical preparations for a trip that's in a place as remote as the Arctic. But we also had the journals that my father and stepmother had used on their different river trips, which was a real gift, and as well as a spiritual autobiography that my father had written in an ongoing class at church. And they were really wonderful, true gifts in that they were insights into the way that they were able to see these wild places and how much these wild places were had touched their souls. And it really, I think, was something that helped to put the trip into perspective, and understanding this love that they had in this place that was such a part of them. And as we grow up and leave home, it's I think we still can have a tendency to look at parents in this very parental way, and to understand them more fully and deeply in these things that made them whole was really a gift.
And in your journey, when you write about your journey in North of Hope, your stepbrother and you, it doesn't sound like you were close, but this kind of forced you to get close, didn't it, this journey?
I think in a way it was a little unfortunate, I think, because that ultimately resulted in some pretty significant complications for the trip. The lack of relationship we had. There was an opportunity that I think ultimately was not manifested in the outcome of the trip for that relationship to be closer, and actually added a whole other level of sadness in many respects. And I think the takeaway from that, among other things, was that I think we have to be strong enough to live our own lives, and that was certainly something that my father had taught me, and I think taught all of us, but also that grief manifests itself in many different ways, and some of those ways are pretty tough and difficult and not very pretty, and I think that was a difficult and a sad lesson from that trip as well. So.
I'm talking with Shannon Huffman Polson. She is the author of North of Hope. I'm James Allen. You're listening to The Teachings of Enoch. We'll be back right after this.
Don't be mad if I cry. It just hurts so bad sometimes. 'Cause every day it's sinking in, and I have to say goodbye all over again. You know, I bet it feels good to have the weight of this world off your shoulders, and now I'm dreaming of the day when I'm finally there with you. Save a place for me, save a place for me. I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. Save a place for me, save some grace for me. I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. La 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 I have asked the questions why, but I guess the answer's for another time. So instead I pray with every tear, yeah, be thankful for the time I had you here. So you just save a place for me, save a place for me. I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. Save a place for me, save some grace for me. I'll be there soon, I'll be there. I wanna live my life just like you did, and make the most of my time just like you did. And I wanna make my home up in the sky just like you did. Oh, but until I get there, until I get there, just save a place for me, save a place for me. 'Cause I will be there soon. Save a place for me, save a place for me. I'll be there soon, I'll be there soon. La 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 la
I'm talking with Shannon Huffman Polson, author of North of Hope, a memoir of a journey she made after her parents were killed by a grizzly bear in Alaska. I'm James Allen, and this is The Teachings of Enoch. This journey that you put together, Shannon, if you were to go back in time, would you still do this journey the same way? Would you still go on this journey?
I would. I think it ended up, although, again, the cathartic nature of it that I had maybe somewhat naively hoped for did not come to pass. I think it was a very important part of this journey of loss and journey of grief and journey of continued growth. And I feel incredibly fortunate that I had a chance to go on it. It also was something that led me to what is as close as I've come to an epiphany. And I would say that in that I initially had understood that landscape to be something that was pretty harsh and unforgiving. And it's a very different landscape than we knew around Anchorage, for example, or even a little bit farther north. And when I went on that trip, it was not something that came as a blinding flash of inspiration, but I think I started to understand that through the beauty and the fragility of that landscape, that there was beauty even in the fragility of life again. And that landscape that is so remote and so beautiful and so untouched, I think is the only kind of a landscape where I could have learned that. And it's become something that has been become a very, very important place to me. And my husband and I actually both went together after we were married, before we had our first son, to take 2 different trips up to the Arctic, just because I really wanted him to see it, and I wanted him to see this place that was so special. It's a place that reminds me of the early Christian mystics that would go out to the desert. The desert fathers and mothers, went to desert places, and in Las Vegas, very much about those desert places. And the Arctic is a place that has that openness and expansiveness that I think was really a particularly important place to continue that healing process.
When you were going on the journey, what were some of the thoughts and feelings that took place as you approached kind of the final part of this journey, going to where your parents were last alive? What were some of the thoughts and they were going through your mind at that point?
I think the initial feeling that I had was very much a deep loneliness. I was not traveling with people that I was close to or felt like I could have conversations with around this loss and this grief. And I felt very much this absence of my father and stepmother. At the same time, I had this idea that they might come walking out to the beach at any time. So there was, I think, working through this numbness and kind of horror of being in this same place, there started to become an understanding of the beauty of the place. And there was one night in particular where we were doing bear watch, where we would take turns staying up for 2 to 3 hours just to be aware if there were any bears in the area. That's a very redundant thing to do. It's not at all a requirement, but given the reasons for our trip, it seemed important. And there's no sunset in the Arctic in the summertime, of course, and so I was on bear watch and watched a little bit of a rain shower come and go in the mountains, and then a rainbow come and go down the valley, and then there were double rainbows that came and went down the valley. And I remembered then the week after the funeral in Anchorage that our priest had told us in the midst of some very unusual dark and stormy weather that he had seen 8 rainbows. And I had this recollection, and it's one of my favorite scenes in North of Hope, actually, is this amazing realization that I was not alone. And at the same time, there was real trepidation about approaching their final campsite in the place where they had died, and seeing places where memories would be triggered, and there were certainly really difficult moments. So those moments, that anxiety was well placed, but it was also a really important thing for me to be able to do. And that when we finally did approach and reach their final campsite, and each of their campsites had been labeled on the map and had been indicated in their journal, so we were able to follow their river journal as we followed our river trip and find all of their campsites. But one of the things that was, and a really important thing for me to be able to do, and I didn't even know it at the time how important it would become, but was that I had communion that my priest in Seattle had given me to take at their final campsite. And I'd forgotten my Book of Common Prayer. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but somehow the liturgy came flowing right back through me, and it was a really, I'm very grateful for that time, and that time that opportunity to pray when prayer was not always accessible to me at that point, and that opportunity to then be part of that communion of saints, which I had not understood in its fullest form until after their death.
I'm talking with Shannon Huffman Polson, author of North of Hope. I'm James Allen, and you're listening to the Teachings of Enoch. We'll be back after this.
That is never far away. breathe. Sometimes I feel it's all that I can do. Pain so deep that I can hardly move. Just keep my eyes completely fixed on you. Lord, take hold and pull me through. So here I am, what's left of me, where glory meets my suffering. I'm alive, even though part of me has died. Take my heart and breathe it back to life. I fall into your arms open wide, when the hurt and the healer collide.
I'm talking with Shannon Huffman Polson, author of North of Hope, a memoir of a journey she made after her parents were killed by a grizzly bear in Alaska. I'm James Allen, and this is the Teachings of Enoch. As you made this trip, prepared for the trip, what was probably the most difficult thing for you emotionally as you either maybe prepared along the way for this trip or actually made the journey?
Oh, wow. I think that one of the things that I could not put out of my mind during the trip and for a good part of the year prior to the trip and after was going over and over in my mind what the events might have been. And it was a difficult thing because it's a violent death, and it was a death that happened when nobody else was around, and their bodies were discovered by another river rafting group that had gone down river probably a day or so after they had. And so that unknowing, but that need to know, despite the fact that it doesn't help you to know, and that there's no way to know, I think was one of the challenges. And I imagined lots of pretty horrible things, and I think that emotionally was pretty difficult. The other thing that was an immediate reaction that took me a long time to work through is that right before the trip, right before their deaths, 2 days before their deaths, my boyfriend and I had broken up, and it was somebody that I had thought that I would marry, and that's somebody that my dad and Kathy had known, and I was a little overcome that they wouldn't know my husband, that they wouldn't know my family, and as it turns out, we got back together and we got married, and I am thrilled to be able to call him my husband, and we have two wonderful sons, and so they did know my husband, and I believe that they know my sons in another way too. But at the time, it was really difficult. I felt very much like I was single, and my dad was my rock, and he was gone, and that was a really hard thing to come to terms with.
Well, Shannon, this has been a very fascinating discussion we're having with Shannon Huffman Polson. She is the author of North of Hope, and it is a memoir of her journey she made after her parents were killed by a grizzly bear in Alaska, and the journey she took up to the Arctic to retrace their steps. Shannon, thank you very much for appearing on the program and talk about your book today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to join you.
What's going on? What are they stopping for?
Love, wisdom, abundant life. That's my hope for you. You've been listening to the Teachings of Enoch. I'm James Allen, your host. You can contact me 702-483-7769. That's 702-483-7769. Or online at teachingsofenoch.com. You can listen to this program every week at the same time on KKVV AM 1060 Las Vegas. You can listen online at kkvv.com on your smartphone using the TuneIn radio app, or listen anytime at teachingsofenoch.com.